Hi there, I'm Kat Sheridan. I'm the director of the Ohio Arts Council's Rife Gallery, and really pleased today to share with you one of our artists in Paper Roots, Women to Watch 2020 for Ohio. This is the last artist talk that we'll have for this series, and apologies for the technical difficulties. This will be recorded and also shared on our social media. So folks that aren't able to join us right now in Zoom, you'll be able to do so and have a look at this great talk later. So again, really pleased to share with you Adrienne Slane. And without further ado, we've been waiting long enough. I'm going to hand over the reins, and Adrienne's going to talk to you all about her process and her work and all sorts of goodies. So please enjoy.
Hi, I'm Adrienne Slane. Thank you so much for joining me this evening, and thank you to the Rife Gallery for including me in the show Paper Routes, which celebrates women who work with paper. I've always been drawn to cutting and collaging with paper from my childhood through my art education as a drawing major at the Cleveland Institute of Art to my current studio practice in Northeast Ohio. As a child, I would cut out images from magazines and categorize them in binders or arrange them on boards. This affinity for working with paper continued through my high school years and college years as I used paper as a medium in printmaking, drawing, and sculpture. Now I create collages using images of things like plants, insects, animals, shells, human anatomy, and planets from a diverse source of ranges from the 1500s to contemporary times. The subject matter and composition of my work is inspired by the history of the Curiosity cabinet, Christian and Eastern iconography, and traditional women's crafts such as folk quilts and paper silhouettes. My work celebrates the beauty and interconnectivity of the universe in a time when our environment is in crisis. One moment, please. To create my collages, I work with a vast library of images I source from old and new books and prints, which I spend a lot of time hunting for at places like library book sales, thrift shops, and eBay. These images come from the pages of medical textbooks, field guides, children's storybooks, and religious texts. I'm always on the lookout for worn and damaged books that are endangered of being discarded. I love giving these beautiful illustrations a new life and new context. The most time-consuming part of my process is cutting all these images out. I find it to be a very meditative process, and it gives me an opportunity to more appreciate the beauty of these images as I cut them from their sources. I arrange these thousands and thousands of images into categories by shape and size, color, subject matter, etc. And I can pull from these as I create my compositions. These images are stored in a floor-to-ceiling system, which I can easily access as I'm pulling from them to mix and match as I create my work. Though I'll sometimes use printouts and reproductions, I try as much as possible to work with old materials. Though my collages are 2D, the old materials have a texture and patina that you just don't find in contemporary paper. I find another bonus of working with old books is that sometimes I find surprises inside like pressed botanicals and notes and scribbles left by their previous owners. I think about how these books and prints journeyed through time to end up at my local library book sale. Here you can see some examples of categorized cutouts, from leaves to flowers to birds' eggs. I try to use as much of the paper from these books and prints as possible, saving odd scraps for future projects. This includes collecting the decorative end papers that are common in old books. These unique pages showcase techniques like marbling, sprinkling, block printing, and embossing, which were developed in countries from the Middle East to Asia to Europe, and became popular in the 18th century. Many of these decorative papers were made by hand, resulting in pages that were completely unique, though later many were made by machine. Though it is rare to find decorative end papers in contemporary books, a renewed interest in this type of decorative paper has led to the creation of societies composed of enthusiasts who share their love of end papers. I often use oval and circular cutouts of these patterns in my work as a decorative element and as an ode to the books that I work from. My goal is to one day learn the art of paper marbling so I can use that in my work. I also save the stained, foxed, and scribbled plain end papers to use in a series of collages that I'll discuss later in this presentation. Again, I am attracted to the ephemeral quality of this paper. While some might find things like acid stains and doodles as blemishes, I view them as a beautiful indication of the passage of time. Using this library of cutouts and papers, when I go to create a collage, I allow the composition to form rather organically. I often select a large central image as my inspiration and then mix and match cutouts around it like pieces in a puzzle until I find a composition that I find engaging. This final composition is finalized with detailed measurements and tracings on vellum to ensure a relatively accurate symmetry. The cutouts are then carefully adhered with archival glue using a paintbrush and sometimes the tip of a needle for detailed parts like insect antenna. Ultimately, the pieces are then weighted down to discourage warping. My compositions are filled with images of elements from nature like shells, fungi, seeds, butterflies, and bones. These were the sorts of items that collectors filled cabinets of curiosities with during an age of discovery and science. These cabinets of curiosities, or wondercommers, proliferated from 1500 to around 1750. The religious and philosophical tradition of Hermeticism was popular at the time, named for the mythical figure Hermes Trismegistus, who is a combination of the Greek god Hermes and the Egyptian god Thoth. It stressed the connection between the microcosm and the macrocosm, the big and small in nature. This great chain of being connected plants, animals, people, and God together. In my work, I like to connect the microscopic to the immense. In my pieces, you'll see images of microscopic things like diatoms and blood cells, directly touching images of things like planets. By connecting these images, I like to reflect upon this great chain of being. Cabinets of curiosity are meant to evoke wonder by creating unsystematic, often random displays of exotic objects like shells and taxidermy. These cabinets ranged in scale from a few drawers to an entire room. Here you can see a whole room of curiosities being admired in the 1500s, with even the ceiling mounted with specimens. Natural objects were admired as works of art in of themselves and helped create a culture of explorers, collectors, and illustrators. Sometimes collected elements are arranged into fantastical, whimsical patterns or objects, like this sculpture made from shells in the 17th century. Objects like this were meant to create a sense of mystery and celebrate the fantastic. In fact, some of the specimens included in cabinets of curiosities included items like mermaids and unicorn horns. Unfortunately, this sense of wonder that manifested itself in the unsystematic display of the curiosity cabinet fell out of fashion in the late 18th century as the modern museum prioritized orderly displays. But museums like the British Museum and the Brooklyn Museum have created modern curiosity cabinets in their collections for viewers to explore. For example, the Brooklyn Museum's visible storage gallery acts as a cabinet of curiosity by creating a dense display of objects in glass vitrines, rolling racks, and accessible drawers. I like to think of my studio as a large cabinet of curiosity. Over the years, I've filled it with Victorian era taxidermy, dioramas, shells, coral, insect specimens, beach glass, seed pods, feathers, bird nests, bones, and other things I've discovered while traveling, working in my garden, hiking, and beachcombing. These are displayed in cases, jars, and boxes in a random way, like the curiosity cabinet of the past. I have a great appreciation for the complex forms of elements in nature that are often overlooked, whether it be a dried seed pod or a shell, or even a dead moth. Here are some views from my studio. This slide depicts an antique collection of beetles I acquired. Not only do I preserve these delicate natural collections, but frequently restore elements of my Victorian era taxidermy. I never kill or harm any creature I personally collect. I only gather things no longer living or objects abandoned by animals that no longer use them. I also only acquire taxidermy that was made over 100 years ago to ensure that no contemporary living being is killed to enhance my collection. This year has given me a great chance to explore my local natural habitat and collect specimens as my life slowed down due to COVID. I developed a new appreciation for the nature in my own backyard. Being surrounded by these specimens as I work is certainly inspiring. As I work with images from nature, I can view the real thing in my studio space. Coinciding with the popularity of the Cabinet of Curiosity, there was a wealth of illustrations created that depicted the sorts of elements that collectors sought for their displays. In this time of exploration and science, people wanted to see examples of the plants, animals, insects, anatomy, rocks, and shells that were being discovered across the globe. Illustrators took great care creating detailed, colorful illustrations that could be accessed in books and prints. They drew, painted, and engraved their images by observing both living and preserved specimens. Here is a depiction of Albertus Seba, who created one of the largest cabinets of curiosities in the Netherlands in his time. He published a famous thesaurus of animals and plants created by various artists and engravers that he hired. Here is a page from the thesaurus printed in 1731. These illustrations not only depicted specimens with accuracy, but did so in visually engaging ways that use elements like pattern and symmetry to draw the viewer in. While some artists presented straightforward depictions of specimens, others did so in more elaborate fashion, including detailed scenes of a wealth of decorative elements. Here are some more examples of natural illustrations from the 1500s to 1800s, many of which are hand-colored. This depiction of zoophytes was created during the United States exploring expedition, an exploring and surveying venture of the Pacific Ocean and surrounding lands conducted by the United States from 1838 to 42. Naturalists, botanists, and mineralogists and taxidermists were brought along, and many illustrated volumes were published afterwards. Illustrators were often collectors and explorers themselves, or were hired by scientists and explorers to provide illustration for their written studies and collections. Unfortunately, as much of this time of discovery produced important advances in science and art, it sometimes led to the exploitation of native peoples and the very wildlife and habitats that were meant to be celebrated, an early foreshadowing of what was to come. My collages honor this history of illustration that encouraged exploration, wonder, and appreciation of nature in decades past. When I am sourcing images, I am obviously drawn to ones with a lot of color and pattern, like butterflies and shells. I'm also interested in elements with interesting shapes like fungi and snakes. I appreciate that some of the images I work with are more illustrative and reveal the unique style of the artist, while others are very realistic looking and could almost be mistaken for photographs. I believe that a renewed appreciation for nature is absolutely necessary in a time when our environment is in crisis and facing threats from vast wildlife fires to poaching to invasive species spread by humans. As we spend more and more of our time indoors glued to our screens, we are losing our sense of wonder and curiosity when it comes to nature. As this chart from the Ohio Department of Natural Resources shows, the number of threatened, endangered, and downright extinct species in Ohio alone is greatly concerning. The greatest impetus for the creation of my work is to hopefully invoke some of this appreciation and wonder for the nature that we coexist with and must be better stewards of. I think art can certainly be a tool used to bring attention to issues facing our environment. And paper made from plant materials found in our environment is a great medium to do so. As I mentioned earlier, Hermeticism was a popular belief system during the age of exploration and science that led to the creation of curiosity cabinets and a wealth of nature illustrations. Its followers believe in a chain that connects nature and humans and God. I do find the spiritual in nature and have been inspired by religious imagery like mandalas from Eastern religions and icons from Christian religions. The geometric configuration of symbols in mandalas has been used as a tool of spiritual guidance in religions like Hinduism and Buddhism for thousands of years. What attracts me to these images is the way in which elements of color, pattern, and symmetry draw the viewer in to ultimately have a more meditative spiritual experience. I often create compact, round compositions that have an almost kaleidoscopic effect. As in a mandala, I hope the viewer is drawn in closer to appreciate the individual elements that make up the whole. They will discover that though the images might appear symmetrical, many of them contain small differences. I search for cutouts of images that are similar in subject, shape, and size, but are in fact from separate sources. I also appreciate when the viewer starts to see similarities in form, how the shape of a certain shell resembles a butterfly, or how a certain flower in a microorganism could almost be interchangeable. Here's a piece from my mandala series created with images of eels, woodpeckers, snails, butterflies, and mushrooms. I enjoy how all of these disparate elements work to create a whole image, which can be viewed in macro as the overall mandala or in the micro, with all the individual pieces coming into view. As someone who was raised in the Catholic Church, I have also always had an affinity for Christian iconography and reliquaries. Again, I appreciate how the decorative details of these devotional images and objects lead to a more meditative, spiritual experience in which one can focus on the micro and the macro. I appreciate Rife Gallery celebrating women who work with the medium of paper. This honors a history of craft practiced predominantly by women who were largely denied access to pursue fine arts like painting and sculpture. These women cut and gathered scraps of fabric and paper to create images that reflected their daily lives, their environment, and their folk histories. I think working with saved and repurposed materials is an important example to follow in a time when mass consumerism impacts the fragility of our planet. This is one of the reasons I work with old materials. This is an example of a folk quilt sewn by Mary Jane Hannaford. In the 19th and 20th centuries, when quilts could be created for more than just providing warmth, they became mediums for expressing artistic, social, and sometimes political statements. Their makers, often women, were taught by relatives and friends. They saved fabric scraps to create colorful patterns and images, often including plants and animals. Similarly, women also saved cutouts from books, magazines, advertisements, letters, and wallpaper to create whimsical scrapbooks, paper dollhouses, and collages. Here we see an example of a young girl's paper dollhouse and a humorous collage where ducks are graced by ladies' heads. Another form of papercraft that was easily available to women was creating silhouettes. From around 1500 to the 1860s, before the common use of photography, people could use scraps of paper and fabric to cut profiles. This was far cheaper than the cost of having a portrait painted or sculpted, and it made it accessible to people from all walks of life. In fact, the phrase "a la silhouette" was applied to things which were considered cheap. This deceptively simple medium offered a way to capture a diversity of individuals and even narratives. They could also be used as tokens of friendship and romance, or to commemorate the deceased. Paper cutouts were also sometimes made of nature specimens, like this one by Philip Otto Runge, who created freehand cutouts of plants like poppies and cornflowers. Another artist known for her cutouts of accurate botanical specimens was Mary Delaney, who used tissue paper and hand coloration to create what she referred to as paper mosaics. Her work became so popular that donors sent her flowers to cut, and she earned the patronage of kings and queens. While the history of women's folk craft has inspired my studio practice in general, I've created several bodies of work, specifically series seen here. I have created collages from old paper, from books, ledgers, letters, and other sources, much of it containing fragments of handwritten script. I like how the script removed of its context, because it becomes an almost abstract element in the work that can still be read on further examination. Part of the title of these works is memento, which I take from the phrase memento mori. Memento moris were popular in the 16th and 17th centuries as a way to remember departed loved ones, and came in the form of jewelry, painting, and embroideries. By including this aged paper handled and written on by those no longer alive, I think of these works as a form of memento mori. In these pieces, I often include images of the scissors, an important tool for women in their craft, and obviously for me, and traditional silhouettes as seen in this piece. As photography became more accessible and traditions like silhouettes faded away, women were still often denied access to this new medium. However, a simpler photographic process called cyanotype was one used by photographic pioneers like Anna Atkins. This English botanist and photographer is often considered to be the first person to have published a book of photographic images, and was perhaps the first woman to create a photograph. When her friend Sir John Herschel invented the cyanotype process in 1842, she used it to expose dried algae specimens, which she self-published in installments called Photographs of British Algae, Cyanotype Impressions. She also created volumes featuring flowering plants and ferns, which are now extremely valuable and prized. Since the cyanotype process was simple and cheap, only requiring 2 chemicals, it was a way for women to make impressions of things like plants and lace. To create a cyanotype, paper is coated in certain iron compounds. When this paper is exposed to UV light and washed in water, it creates Prussian blue images. The exposed images create the white negative because their physical presence blocks the light from hitting the paper, therefore preventing the chemical reactions in these specific areas. Though this form of photography fell out of favor, it has experienced a recent resurgence among contemporary artists, especially women. They are using imagery of specimens and fabrics in new and intriguing ways. Inspired by this tradition, I have created several series of cyanotypes on paper. Instead of working with actual specimens, I have exposed paper cutouts instead. I temporarily adhere these cutouts onto a large piece of plexi that acts as my negative. I expose this negative onto large pieces of chemically treated paper, which I source from an island in Washington state. One thing I really appreciate about creating cyanotypes is that they are a record of a very specific time. Depending on the time of day, the time of year, and the weather conditions, each cyanotype I create is a different hue of blue, from rather light to a blue that is almost black. These pieces, in a way, are like a calendar of the sun. Well, I look much to the past for inspiration, whether it be cabinets of curiosities, religious art, or folk craft traditions. I am also interested in contemporary artists working with paper and themes of nature. For much of art history, works on paper were viewed as secondary to works created using mediums like oil paint and marble. It is exciting to see a new appreciation for such an important medium, one that has existed for over 2,000 years. I look to artists like Joachim Nordstrom, who creates whimsical collages featuring insects and animals, and Hilary Waters Fayol, who is one of the artists reviving the art of cyanotype, creating mandalas of specimens. I appreciate the collages of Jane Hammond, who uses cutouts of butterflies and flowers in a wonderful series of vase arrangements. Artist Kara Walker draws from the tradition of silhouettes by addressing the ugly history of slavery in our country. And artists like Valerie Hammond and Kiki Smith also work with themes of nature with works on paper. These and other artists inspire my practice creating works on paper. I hope my collages inspire some of the wonder that has drawn people to appreciate nature throughout human history. This is especially important in an age when we are so often disconnected from the living world around us. Feel free to type them in the chat box. In the meantime, I will talk about some of my So in this piece, I started by selecting a central image I wanted to work with, which was the moth. And I've adhered that to some of the decorative end papers that I talked about in my presentation. And you can see other elements of the decorative in orbs and in the pedestal-like object in the piece. I'm interested in symmetry as a way to draw the viewer in. However, upon closer examination, you can also often see that it's not perfect symmetry. For example, the dahlias in this piece are two different dahlias, or the moths are two different moths, though they look similar. And I hope that is a reward of the viewer coming in closer and having a more meditative experience. And you can see in this piece, in this composition, I don't have the images all touching. Sometimes I like to create a more lacy composition as opposed to this one where everything is relatively compact. It creates almost an overall object. And sometimes people start to see like a tree of life or orbiting universe within these overall shapes. And I included in this one, this all-seeing eye, which is an element that we see across all cultures and religions. In this piece, one of the central images, which is the green sphere in the middle, is actually a microscopic organism. And as I talked about, I'm really interested in the micro and the macro. So this thing that normally would be invisible to the human eye is this central object that draws you in, where things that would generally be much larger than it, like the Luna moth, are not as prominent. In this piece, I worked with this series of moths from a specific engraving. They're really beautiful to see up close. They're hand colored and have a lot of texture. And it's something that is really important to me to create for the viewer. So thank you so much for taking a look at my work, and let me know if you have any questions.
Okay, our first question is, can you talk about some of your favorite images, their meanings, and your use of repetition in these images?
Sure. So I'll just use some of the pieces behind me as a reference. So some of my favorite images to use are butterflies. You see a lot of those, and also fungi. They're just naturally really beautiful item in nature, and they have a lot of symmetry and interesting shapes and colors and patterns. And they're really good to work with when I'm trying to create these very dense, symmetrical compositions. Pattern is important to me because, like I was talking about with mandalas and icons, a lot of times using the decorative to draw people in to start to see these individual elements that work to create a whole. And I think pattern is a good tool So not only is it just purely beautiful, but it can act as a way to draw people in and start to examine all these little cutouts and see how they're similar, how they're different, how they reflect each other. And this to me is a reflection of the universe that we live in. All these disparate elements working to create a whole, whether they be the tiniest microscopic element to something huge like a planet.
We have another question from Carol Freed, who would like to know, who said, first, thank you. And second, do you create dioramas?
I dabbled a little bit. It's something I would like to do more. I've made a few pieces where I've mounted the images so they're 3D actually and have more depth to them. And it's something I'd like to explore further, especially given my affinity for having dioramas in my studio space that inspire me. So definitely something I'd like to pursue further. I know my collages are very flat, very 2D, and I do like to bring out the textures of the paper. When you see them in person, these old papers have so much patina. You can see like little stains, little marks. And so there's a little bit of dimension with that, but it could definitely be pushed further and where these images literally come off the page.
All right, we have another question from Amy this time. Do you think about making artwork as labor? And can you explain why?
Artwork as labor. I guess so, just because it is my job. So it is a form of labor. But I also think of it very much as a meditative process. So in that way, I start to dissociate it from labor. And it's a fine line. I think about traditional women's craft where women were gathering these scraps and saving that. And that was a lot of labor. That was a lot of thought and working with your friends and community members to save and gather. A lot of times things like quilt making or scrapbooking was almost communal. And I spend a lot of time sourcing these materials. That is super labor intensive in of itself. It's just scouring book sales and cutting. But I think once I start to get to, more of the composition and laying things out, when it becomes much more of like an organic process, that sense of labor almost becomes a form of meditation. So I think for me, it's a balance between labor and a form of meditation.
All right, Carol has another question. She'd like to know, how do you preserve fragile elements that you work with?
So I preserve them by very careful storage. And I'm often breaking off insect legs and antennas of like super fragile paper because I work with paper that can be 100, 200, 300 years old, and it started to degrade a bit. And so it's really easy to knock off these or rip these really fragile elements. And that's why I work with super tiny tools, like tiny scissors, a tiny X-Acto knife. But I'm very careful when I'm handling them. I try to be very thoughtful. It's almost like a reverent experience. And I store them in a way on these big trays where everything is like in single layers, and I'm very careful about when I mix and match them. But there are definitely times, like I have a little hospital for my images on my drafting table that I need to fix and glue parts that have gone ripped or fallen off. But it's very much a practice of delicacy and honoring these very fragile materials.
All right, Karen has come through with a comment and a question. First, her comment is outstanding creative work. And her question is, have you worked in the book arts?
I have not. And I know that sometimes people who love books can be a little upset by the fact that I cut books up. And I try to be very careful to work with books that are falling apart. I buy books at book sales and thrift shops that probably will be thrown out if I don't buy them. So I definitely have an appreciation for books. Obviously, they're like the source of my material, and I'll find ones that I refuse to cut up. And having worked with books so much and appreciating, you know, everything from the end papers to the marginalia that people write in them, I could definitely see pursuing creating books of my own. That's an interesting thought to pursue. So hopefully down the line.
All right, from Jordan. Jordan asks, what are your favorite types of books to source images from? And do you have a favorite image that you've ever used in your work?
So my favorite books to source images from are probably science textbooks that I find that were created for sometimes children or young adults in their learning at school. They often have really whimsical, wonderful illustrations of plants and animals and other elements, and you can really see the unique style of the illustrator in these images because they're trying to appeal to a younger audience. So I really appreciate those whimsical illustrations. There's such a vast array of sources that I work from, and each has its own special appeal. In terms of an image that has most appealed to me, I really fell in love with this book that was full of dahlia illustrations, and you can see some of them in the work behind me. They're the really large, luscious, like pink and red dahlias. And this book comes from England, and it was made about 75 years ago. And I've actually bought this book like 10 different times because I use those dahlia images so much. And I love their color, their vibrancy. I also love dahlias in general. And they make really good central images. They have that sort of mandala effect contained within themselves.
From Audrey, Audrey would like to know which type of adhesive is best for delicate pieces.
So I work with a museum quality glue. It's actually an adhesive that, you know, curators at a museum would use. And the chemical process or properties are so careful that they actually won't ship it in cold months because it could affect you know, the chemical makeup of the glue. So I use this, and I try to use a very small amount of glue so I don't have a lot of like excess glue seeping out or a lot of warpage. And so I use a little tiny paintbrush to apply the glue, and I also use a sewing needle when I have like smaller bits like an insect leg or something like that. I'll just apply this very tiny amount. Something that's super important in my practice is being like very precise and very clean. I don't want anything to distract from the image and the composition. So I like no signs of glue or any other like marks or wrinkles in the paper. So when we talked about labor earlier, I think that's one of the main aspects of my labor is just being very conscious of my level of craft and creating just this very clean images. And I think that brings more attention to the old paper that I'm using that does have these flaws, which I enjoy, but they have like the foxing and the staining and like little wrinkles. And I think having that juxtaposed against just super clean white background that's free of any marks helps bring out those special aspects of that old paper I'm working with.
Maria said, beautiful work.
Thank you.
How do you know when your pieces are complete? I feel like they could just grow and grow.
Very true. It is hard to know. For me, it's just a very intuitive, organic process. And if I just had them laying about, they could easily just keep growing and growing. I just keep mixing and matching. Like I'll pull out trays and trays of images, and I'll just start pulling, you know, from these trays, and I'll just have hundreds of these images out, and I'm mixing and matching them on the page to create a composition. And it can go through countless iterations where I'm taking an image out, replacing it with something else, adding on, subtracting things. And I like to lay out a composition and then let it sit for a day or a couple days or a couple weeks and keep coming back and looking at it and taking something out and trying something else. And then it just reaches a point where I'm satisfied with it. And I think that the object, the overall object of the composition, satisfies the criteria that I'm looking for. I like to have a lot of this like negative space around it so that you can really get a sense of like that compact, colorful image in the middle. So that white space kind of acts as this, you know, canvas to allow that to happen. So I've worked with series like the folk series that you saw, you know, some of those really fill up the whole page, or the cyanotype ones. And that was inspired more by these scrapbooks or folk quilts where they really fill up their entire medium. So I work with a little bit of both methods, but for these collages, I really like having that really compact, central, almost kaleidoscopic image, and not fill up the entire page.
Karen would like to know if you are familiar with Maria Sabia Marin.
No, I am not.
There's that person looks to have been alive 1647 to 1717, so
Okay.
probably someone that has some clear similarities. But
Oh, cool. I'll have to check it out. Thank you so much.
yeah, so I would love to know how you came to this place of using these items. Like, clearly you're a well-versed artist, you have really strong craft. How did you get to a place where you collage in such a meticulous way? Like, what were your beginnings that led you to land on this?
Sure. So as I said in my presentation, you know, for as long as I can remember, like even back to kindergarten, if I got a magazine, I was cutting out images, and I was really into nature as a child and geology. So I would try to get, you know, magazines about geology, and I would ultimately like cut out pictures of the rocks and minerals, and I'd create like newsletters for people about it and glue them in. And I would just create these big, now we'd probably call them mood boards, but I would just like cut a bunch of things out. It might be like all animals, and like glue them on a big poster board and have it in my room. So it just, for as long as I can remember, have been about collecting and sorting and organizing and adhering. And over the years, you know, as you see in my studio, I'm a big collector, and I would collect, you know, old books, old prints. They just kind of sat around. And, you know, sometimes I would get books that were so damaged where I'd have to just like cut out pages, or, you know, cut out an image and save it from this, you know, really dilapidated book or print. And I think that just eventually led to me thinking about including them in collages, because I don't see many artists today collaging with like really old materials, old illustrations like that. So I think that intrigued me. And, you know, having this super precise labor is something that I think I really learned in art school, where we were taught, you know, these skills to be very, very precise artists. So I think that just kind of translated into my studio practice now.
Great. Okay. I'd also like to know, what are you up to now and what's next?
All right. So I'm continuing all the series that I showed you some slides of. Currently, I'm making work for a show about women's suffrage at the University of Akron. And I am planning on making a triptych in the vein of the full quilt series that I showed. So I'm thinking about women's suffrage. I'm thinking about women's craft. Again, you know, women who were quilting, who were scrapbooking, and a lot of times these really beautiful, lovely images that created had a social or political context to them. Sometimes it was, you know, pretty obvious, and sometimes it was subtle. You really had to look for it. So I'm looking to use like this really old paper, thinking about how like women have really beautiful script and the way they wrote letters and, you know, communicated, whether it be like personal or about politics. So right now I'm just sort of in the brainstorming mode for these pieces. So yeah, hopefully you guys can check it out.
All right. I am going to pop on here and just go ahead and thank everybody for joining us tonight. Sorry about the tech delays that we had, but we were able to see ourselves through, and we're so happy that a good portion of you were able to join us here on Zoom. This will be published to our YouTube channel as well, so those of you that didn't catch the front end, you'll be able to see it. And again, I want to thank the Ohio Advisory Group so much for the collaboration and bringing this to bear with the Ohio Arts Council, as well as the legislature that allows this great space to operate, uplifting and amplifying Ohio artists. I hope you all have a great rest of your evening. Thank you so much. Take care.
Thank you.